Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I'll be showing you how I built a piece of furniture that I've called the Seattle end table. It starts here by breaking down and milling up some 8/4 black walnut. A few passes on the joiner, over to the planer, and then back to the joiner. After that, I set my table saw fence and rip a clean edge on the opposite side of the piece. This is without a doubt the single most difficult piece of furniture that I have ever built. What makes it so difficult was that there was very few flat surfaces to act as reference faces. This project relies really heavily on laser cut templates, and I'm fortunate enough to have a 60-watt CO2 laser in my shop that I can make these with. Here I am laying out the template for the legs. Using a T-bevel and a marking knife, I am laying out some miters. This will allow this piece of stock to be essentially folded to roughly conform to the pattern that the leg template needs. Because this piece has so few square and flat sides, I decided to use this dado here as essentially the reference point. I'll lay this out with a pencil and a marking knife. We'll cut the dado and then use a piece of sacrificial stock to use to align the template and make sure that all of the three legs come out identical. So here I am setting the depth of the table saw blade that I'll use to cut that dado. This is a 24 tooth flat top grind blade, which would normally be used as a rip blade. There's just too much chance of tear out or blowout to use in a crosscut scenario, but in a situation like this where I need a dado with a perfectly flat bottom, it's actually very helpful and saves a lot of time from setting up the dado stack. With my miter gauge and setting the tooth in the knife wall created by the marking knife, I'll go ahead and plow the dado. With the dado cut, I will remove that 24 tooth blade and swap in a crosscut blade for the miters themselves. This will leave a much higher quality of cut and therefore a much nicer joint for the miter itself. This is an 80 tooth alternate top bevel blade. This CMT blade has pretty good performance at a very reasonable price. Here I am setting the table saw to the proper miter angle. This miter angle doesn't really matter as long as it's equal for all the joints and results in sufficient curve to place the template on the leg blank. So I set the outside edge of one of the teeth into the knife wall created by the marking knife for the first miter. The only kind of important thing here is to take out as little material as possible just to get the best possible grain wrap. With all the miters cut, back over at the workbench, I can lay this out. And from here, you'll be more clearly able to see how important that dado is in locating the template and how this will all fall together. With the piece laid flat, I can get some blue tape over the miter joints. This will help to hold the piece together while it's being clamped, since it's very complicated to clamp, since there aren't any real flat surfaces or 90-degree surfaces to get a clamp on squarely. I use Type on 3 because this is an end grain joint. Type on 3 is just marginally stronger. I will go back and add some splines to this, as the miter joint, even with the stronger type end, is not going to be sufficient. And like I said, this is a very complicated joint to clamp just because there's nothing straight. I could have made some calls. That would probably be the right thing to do. But these quick grip clamps give a little bit of counter force just to bring everything in tight. With the glue dried, I was able to cut the slots for the miter splines in. Of course, I mismeasured and did it entirely wrong and ended up having to remake the entire piece. So what you see me cutting here on the bandsaw is actually a different piece than the one you watched. To avoid making the same mistake a second time, I broke these legs apart on the bandsaw and ran them over the jointer just to clean up a fresh face. And then took them down to final thickness on the planer. With the legs finally dimensioned, I performed the sketchiest cut of the entire project. If I had to do this all over again, I probably would have thought up a better setup, maybe on the router table or an auxiliary fence or something like that. This was a pretty sketchy cut because there's so little of the leg in contact with the table saw. There's just not a lot of reference surface. From there, I was able to use my table saw to rip some stock down to make the splines that will go in the slots that I just cut. Grain orientation is very important here. And you can see that even with my 3 horsepower table saw, this was still a pretty slow cut. To glue in the splines, I used a little Tight Bond Dark. I wasn't trying to draw attention to these. That's one of the reasons I made them out of the same walnut as the rest of the legs, instead of contrasting species like maple or cherry. And this Tight Bond Dark just helps to reinforce that. It dries dark and really helps keep the cohesiveness of this leg and the curve. Once the glue on the splines was dry, we could take that out of clamps and start to flush up the splines with the leg blank. Once the splines are flushed up with a low angle block plane, it's time to clear out the dado. And for that, I just used the Dazuki, which is a type of Japanese pole saw, and a chisel. Even though I use a lot of power tools for most operations, there is something that's just extra rewarding about using some hand tools. With the dado cleared out, it's time for everyone's favorite step, sanding. In order to help keep the corners sharp, I'll gang these together with some F-clamps, and this just helps keep everything flat and prevents rolling over any of the edges. Here I'm installing what I'll refer to as the reference key. This will keep all of these leg blanks together so that when they get template routed, they're all identical. A little bit of double stick tape will keep the whole stack together and in line with that reference key. A little more double stick tape for the third leg. And back on the table saw, I'll set the bevel angle to cut the tops of the legs at an angle that will be parallel to the ground. This quick squeeze clamp helps keep everything tight against the miter fence. With the template affixed to the leg blank stock, I'll go ahead and hog out most of the waste of the bandsaw. Getting as close to the template as I possibly can without damaging it is really best for the router. It reduces a lot of the stress on the bit and the router motor when you're flush trimming. With the majority of the waste removed, it's time to flush trim these on the router table. To start the template routing process, I use a top bearing compression bit. And in the router table, that bearing's really on the bottom. Then to finish up the legs, I switch over to a top bearing compression bit. With the legs complete, it was time to basically use the same process all over again to make the center puck that would hold the entire table together. To do that, I cut a circle roughly out on the bandsaw, used a laser cut template, and another flush trimmed bit in the router table. Since absolutely nothing is square on this table, I went back to the hand tools to cut the slots. These slots will index into the dado in the legs. With the edges defined, I was able to hog out a bunch of the waste here with some chisels and a stop block set in the T-track. With most of the material removed, I went back and pared that flat and cleaned up those surfaces a little bit. Again, back at the router table, a 1/8 inch diameter round over just breaks these edges. The last step in creating the legs was to create a bird's mouth or rabbit in the top that will accept the center hub ring that will support the tabletop. To do that, I used a brass bushing to guide the router against another laser cut template. This template actually has 2 layers, one to locate it centrally between the 3 legs and the other to guide the bushing. The brass bushing that I was using here was just slightly thicker than the plywood that I was using to create the templates out of, so a piece of corrugated cardboard there just helps space that out a little bit. This bit was a 3-flute all carbide spiral upcut bit, and it just did a beautiful job of leaving absolutely 0 tear out and a perfectly clean cut. Unfortunately here my router motor wasn't doing so hot. It's been ingesting a lot of sawdust. I think the downdraft dust collection is actually overpowering the cooling fan, and I'm moving to a different router table shortly in the future. In this shot here, you can really see how that brass bushing rides against the template to provide a perfect contour for the inside of that leg. And because there's an offset due to that brass bushing, a flush trim router bit on a trim router will clean this up just beautifully. I did set the router depth just a little bit too deep and took an extra 1/16 of an inch out of the leg. Not a big deal on the final product, but compromised the quality of the cut a little bit. And with that, that's the entire base of the table created. I had intended to record this all in one video, but at the nearly 27-minute mark here and a good bit more to do, I think it's best to break this into 2 separate videos. So stay tuned for part 2. In that video, I'll build the top and attach it to the base.